everybody, welcome to our first grammar lesson. So before we begin learning the ins and outs of the Spanish language, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to briefly cover some grammar stuff that's going to be really helpful later on. I can imagine that many of you are probably grumbling right now, and that's completely okay. I don't expect everybody to love grammar, but I will tell you that this is very important to learning another language, and so I will do my best to make this as interesting as humanly possible. The first concept we're going to make sure that everybody understands is a verb. I'm sure you all have heard the word before and have some sort of an idea of what it means, but before I give you a full and more complete definition, I wanted to take a moment to share with you guys a relevant video clip. It's actually a commercial that was on TV all the time when I was a kid, and I would never pass up a chance to relive the sweet 90s.
It's the action that moves you. It's what gets you up and out. It's what gets you going. It's what gets you trying things you've never tried before. It's your verb. Got one yet? For more info, get the okay to check out verbnow.com. Verb, it's what you do.
I kind of wonder if verbnow.com still exists. Anyway, aside from being an infamous phrase of the 90s, verb, it's what you do, is also a really good and really simple definition of what a verb is. But now we're going to get into a little bit more of a detailed explanation. Verbs are words that describe actions, occurrences, or states of being. Most of us probably think of actions when we think of verbs, but occurrences and states of being are also important to highlight because things like is, are, happens, exists are also verbs, even though admittedly they're not the most action-packed or exciting. Spanish verbs can be classified or described according to many different characteristics. We are only going to discuss 5 characteristics today. The first characteristic is ending, and the Spanish language has 3 possible endings, and those are AR, ER, and IR. The next one is infinitive. We are going to compare infinitive with conjugated verbs. I guess you can kind of consider these two terms to be opposites. The final 2 verb-related concepts that we're going to look at today are regular and irregular verbs. We are going to get started with infinitive verbs. The term infinitive refers to the most basic state of a verb. Now, any verb in existence, in any language in existence, has an infinitive form. Being that the infinitive form is the most basic form of a verb, these types of verbs show us no information about who is performing the action, which is the subject, or when the action is happening, which is tense. That means that the only thing an infinitive verb shows us is the verb's meaning. So think of the dictionary definition, the way a verb would show up in the dictionary if you were to look it up. Infinitive verbs in English are preceded by the word to, and some examples are to walk, to sing, to play, to eat, etc. We can prove that these are infinitive verbs because we could not put a subject in front of them, and we could also not use a time reference with any of these verbs. For example, I could not say, I to walk yesterday. I could not say, Mary to sing every day. Remember, the who is performing the action and the when the action is happening is not reflected in this form. Now, Spanish infinitives are significantly different because instead of having some word like to in front, they actually are reflected in the way that they end. And all Spanish verbs have one of 3 possible endings. Here are those 3 infinitive verb endings. There are AR verbs, which are the most common, followed by ER verbs, and then finally IR verbs, which are the least common. As I stated before, this is pretty much the dictionary form of any verb. So anytime we learn a new verb in class, this is the form that will be presented to you. And also, this is the form that will appear on vocabulary lists. And these 3 different infinitive verb endings are related to the conjugation pattern which the verb will take. Now, this brings us to verb conjugation. Conjugation is a process, and it's a process in which we change an infinitive verb in order to provide important information about the action being performed. Conjugated verbs can provide us with information about the subject, which is who is performing the action, and the tense, which is when the action is happening, which, as we discussed earlier, is information that a verb in the infinitive form cannot portray. Looking quickly at regular versus irregular verbs, this is pretty straightforward. Regular verbs are verbs that follow specific, predictable patterns based on their ending. The great thing about this is that as long as you know the pattern, you could conjugate pretty much any regular verb, even if you've never seen it before. But of course, not everything can always be so easy, and that's where irregular verbs come into play. Irregular verbs do not follow patterns and thus are not predictable. What that means is the only thing we can really do to learn these verbs is just to memorize the conjugated form. Now, the last thing we are going to get into in today's video is just a little bit about tense. Most of you guys are probably pretty familiar with the three big subcategories of tense, which are past, present, and future. But what a lot of people do not realize is that each of those three big tenses contain several different smaller types of tenses. What I want you guys to do is to just take a moment in your head, think about how you would describe to somebody the present tense. Did you come up with something? And if so, how many of you came up with something along the lines of things that are happening right now? If you did, you are not incorrect, but there's a lot more to the present tense than just that immediate present. In fact, the majority of this year in class, we are going to focus on what is called the simple present tense. And the simple present tense doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on right now. The simple present tense form of a verb is used to describe actions that happen regularly, generally, or habitually, which means out of habit. Let's take a look at some examples. Santiago walks his dog in the park. Walks is in the simple present tense. Another example sentence could be Valentina studies in the library. These simple present tense verbs have everything to do with what happens on a regular basis. And we can prove that by adding some time references at the end. An example of a time reference that relates to a regular event that we could add to the end of the first sentence would be every Saturday. The resulting sentence, Santiago walks his dog in the park every Saturday, now shows something that he does on a regular basis. If we were to do the same thing with the second example sentence, we could end up with something like Valentina studies in the library when she doesn't have volleyball practice. Neither of these examples would work with something like right now, as that would be a different type of present tense. Okay, eso es todo por el día de hoy. That's all for today. Make sure you take a moment to complete the activities that follow the video. Adiós y hasta la próxima!